Welcome to the Funnel Effect.
It is, it's really fantastic to be here today.
Yeah, today we are doing something that I frankly think we just don't do enough of in the modern world. We are stopping the clock, we are completely ignoring the 24-hour news cycle, and we are stepping into a time machine. We are going back to July 1986.
Right. A very specific moment in time.
Extremely specific. And we are going to look at two documents that, on the surface at least, they might seem like dry, dusty medical archives. But when you actually read them, and I mean really read them, looking at the charts, looking at the confidence intervals, they aren't just papers. They are blueprints. They are the instruction manuals for how humanity learned to distinguish truth from noise in medicine.
That is, well, it's a bold claim, but I actually think it holds up perfectly. We're looking at the birth of the modern mega trial. We're looking at the exact moment when doctors stopped relying on their gut feelings, their anecdotes, and started relying on cold, hard, massive data.
Yeah, but before we get into the philosophy of it, I need to officially read the sources into the record for this deep dive. We have two absolute heavy hitters on the desk today. The primary source is a massive study titled Randomized Trial of Intravenous Atenolol among 16,027 cases of suspected acute myocardial infarction, ISIS-1. And this was conducted by the ISIS-1 Collaborative Group and published in The Lancet on Saturday, July 12, 1986.
Right, a landmark paper in cardiology. I mean, it is one of the absolute giants of the field.
It really is, and Writing Shotgun today is a secondary source from that very same issue of The Lancet in 1986. It is titled HLA Matching and Pre-Transplant Blood Transfusions in Cadaveric Renal Transplantation A Changing Picture with Cyclosporin. The authors include G. Lundgren, D. Albrechtsen, and their colleagues.
So we have the heart on one side and the kidneys on the other.
We do. And our mission today for you listening is to figure out how these two studies, which look completely different, I mean, different organs, different diseases, different drugs entirely, actually tell two sides of the exact same story. It is the story of medical detective work on a truly massive scale. Because, and I think most people don't realize this, medicine isn't usually about those eureka moments where you find a cure that works 100% of the time, like you see in the movies.
Right, that is totally the Hollywood version. You mix the blue liquid with the red liquid, the smoke clears, and suddenly the zombie virus is cured. In reality, most medical progress is, well, it's a game of inches. You aren't looking for a total cure. You are looking for a 10% edge, or maybe a 15% edge. And the problem is, when the edge is that incredibly small, it is so hard to see.
Exactly. If you have a drug that saves literally everyone, you only need to give it to two people to prove it works. They live, the other two die, boom, you have your proof. But what if you have a drug that saves one life out of every 200?
That is the crux of the entire problem we are looking at today. Because if you treat 10 people, you won't see it. If you treat 100 people, you might still miss it because of the natural randomness of life and death. You really need to zoom out. You need a statistical telescope that can see through the noise.
So we are going to unpack this absolute behemoth of a study, ISIS-1. We're going to look at heart attacks, beta blockers, and how 16,000 people helped answer a question that had been plaguing doctors for years. And then we're going to contrast that with the kidney study to see how technology, specifically a new drug called cyclosporin, completely changes the rules of the game.
It is such a fascinating look at how evidence-based medicine was genuinely forged in the fire of the 1980s.
Let's jump right into the first segment. We are calling this the behemoth. So set the stage for us. It is July 1986. What is the actual vibe in the cardiac ward? Like, what is the fundamental problem we are trying to solve here?
Well, the landscape is really interesting at this point. By 1986, doctors already knew about beta blockers, drugs like atenolol. They knew the basic mechanism, which is that these drugs lower your heart rate and your blood pressure. And there was a very strong suspicion, a hunch really, among cardiologists, that they might help during a heart attack.
So they had a suspect, but not a convicted savior yet.
Exactly. They did not have definitive proof. There had been smaller studies, maybe a few hundred patients here and there in different hospitals, but the results from those were muddy. Some studies showed a benefit, some completely didn't. And the stakes were incredibly high because heart attacks were, and of course still are, a leading killer globally. The thinking was, if we can prevent even one death in every 200 patients we treat, that is a massive victory for public health.
I really want to pause on that 1 in 200 concept because to a listener, saving one person out of 200 sounds, I don't know, it sounds moderate, it sounds small. Why get out of bed for a 1 in 200 shot?
It doesn't sound like a lot to an individual. If a doctor tells you that you have a 0.5% better chance of surviving, you might shrug. But you have to think about the sheer scale of heart disease. Millions of people have heart attacks every single year. If you save 1 in 200 out of a million people, you have just saved 5,000 lives. That is 5,000 families who get to keep their father or their mother. So on a public health level, it is monumental. But statistically, finding that 0.5% is a total nightmare to prove.
And this is exactly where the massive scale of ISIS-1 comes in.
Yes, this is the law of large numbers at work.
Hmm.
The source material explicitly discusses this mathematical reality.
Hmm.
They calculated that to detect a moderate difference, say improving survival by 10 or 15% overall, you cannot just study 500 people. You need at least 20,000 patients to be sure.
20,000. I mean, that is a logistical nightmare, especially in 1986. There is no email. There are no web portals or cloud databases.
It sounds almost impossible. But the core philosophy here is that small trials simply miss the truth. They are too subject to random chance. If you have 500 patients and 3 die in one group and 5 die in the other, that isn't science. That is just a bad Tuesday at the hospital. You can't base global medical protocols on a bad Tuesday.
Right. So the ISIS-1 group decided they had to go big. They recruited 245 coronary care units across 14 different countries.
14 countries, a truly global, massive collaborative effort.
Now, I really want to drill down on the methodology here because this is where the host in me gets a little skeptical. I was reading the patients and methods section of the paper, and I was fully expecting this incredibly rigid, complex set of rules. You know, patient must have X, Y, and Z confirmed by 3 different blood tests before entry. But the paper actually marvels at the, and this is a direct quote, intentional informality of the entry criteria.
That phrase is absolutely key to the whole study, intentional informality.
To me, honestly, that sounds like a polite euphemism for sloppy science. Why would you be informal with a life-or-death, groundbreaking mega trial?
It sounds totally counterintuitive, doesn't it? But it was actually a stroke of absolute genius. You have to put yourself in the environment of the trial. You are in a coronary care unit. A patient comes through the doors, clutching their chest, sweating in absolute agony. It is a high-stress, terrifying situation. Doctors and nurses are frantically busy. If you hand that ER doctor a 10-page bureaucratic form and say, please fill this out, verify the diagnosis with 3 independent lab tests, wait an hour for the results, and then we can enroll them in the study, what do you think happens?
The doctor throws the clipboard in the trash and just treats the patient to save their life?
Exactly. They do not have time for bureaucracy when someone is crashing. So the ISIS-1 organizers said, make it effortless. They intentionally lowered the friction to 0. The entry criteria were incredibly broad. The diagnosis didn't even need to be formally confirmed by a lab.
Wait, really? They didn't even need to know for sure the patient was actually having a heart attack?
No. They literally just needed to suspect an acute myocardial infarction within 12 hours of the symptoms starting. If the doctor looked at the patient and thought, yeah, this looks like a heart attack, that was enough to enter them into the trial.
But doesn't that completely pollute the data? If you enroll a guy who just ate a bad burrito and has really bad indigestion, or someone having a severe panic attack, aren't you watering down the results of your heart medication?
You are. You are absolutely introducing noise into your data set. But their mathematical argument was twofold. First, in the real world of medicine, you have to treat based on suspicion. You do not have the luxury of absolute certainty in that golden first hour. You have to make a judgment call. So they wanted the study to perfectly reflect real-world emergency room conditions.
Okay, that makes practical sense. You want to test the drug in the exact scenario it will actually be used.
Precisely. And second, they knew the sheer volume of patients, 16,000, would wash out that indigestion noise. Even if 5% of the patients didn't actually have a heart attack, the group is so unfathomably big that if the drug truly works on the real heart attacks, the signal of lives saved will still shine through the static.
So it is just a pure numbers game. You willingly accept some messiness at the individual level to get the massive volume at the macro level.
Well, that is exactly the trade-off they made, and it was brilliant.
I also love the technology aspect of how they pulled this off. It is 1986. How on earth did they randomize 16,000 people without computers in every single hospital wing?
They used a 24-hour direct telephone service.
A hotline.
A literal hotline. A doctor would have a patient, they would run to the wall phone, call the number, give you a few quick details about the patient, and the person on the other end of the line would look at a computer-generated list and say, okay, this patient is in the treatment group, or this patient is in the control group. Done. Hang up the phone.
And they were irrevocably entered.
Irrevocably. Once that line on the printed list in the call center was crossed off, it was used. No takebacks, no changing your mind if the patient got worse.
Let's talk about the actual protocol then. If I'm the patient, I come in sweating, the doctor calls the hotline, and I get randomized to the treatment group. What actually happens to me?
You get immediate aggressive action. That is the crux of the treatment arm. You receive an intravenous injection of atenolol between 5 and 10 milligrams right then and there in the bed.
Hive. So it goes straight into the bloodstream. We are not giving them a pill and waiting 45 minutes for it to digest.
Straight into the vein, immediate beta blockade. And then, once you are stabilized, you follow that up with oral tablets, 100 milligrams a day for the next 7 days while you are in the hospital.
Okay, and what if the coin flips the other way and I am in the control group?
Then you get standard care, which in the context of 1986 meant avoiding beta blockers entirely unless they became absolutely necessary for some other escalating reason.
Now, here is something I found really surprising when reading the source, and again, it triggered my "is this good" science alarm. There was no placebo.
Correct. This is an open study.
But usually we hear that double-blind, placebo-controlled is the absolute gold standard of science. If I know I am getting the drug, and the doctor knows I am getting the drug, doesn't that inherently bias the entire result?
It is the gold standard for subjective things.
Mhm.
Absolutely. If we were testing a new headache pill and I knew I took the real drug, I might feel better just because of the psychological placebo effect. Or the doctor might ask me how I am feeling in a more optimistic leading tone. That introduces huge bias.
Right, because pain is subjective.
But ISIS-1 wasn't measuring pain. They weren't measuring mood or mobility. They were measuring vascular mortality. Exactly. You are either dead or you are alive. There is no placebo effect for death. You cannot think yourself alive because you believe you took a fancy new pill. Bias affects subjective endpoints, but it doesn't really affect mortality statistics. A heartbeat is a heartbeat. So they felt mathematically safe skipping the placebo to get the massive numbers they needed.
That makes a ton of sense when you frame it like that. If the metric is literally pulse or no pulse, you don't need a sugar pill to validate it.
Exactly. And honestly, think about the logistics. Trying to manage and distribute matching placebo V injections and visually identical dummy pills for 245 different hospitals across 14 countries, that logistical hurdle alone might have killed the study before it even began. By keeping it open, they made it physically possible to execute.
Okay, so they have set up this massive, elegantly simple machine. They have 16,027 patients enrolled. Let's move to segment 2, the results. They run the numbers. What did they actually find? Did the drug work?
It did work. But again, you really have to look closely at the data to see it. It wasn't a landslide victory. It was a solid, distinct, moderate improvement. The headline number they published is a 15% reduction in vascular mortality in the treated group during that first critical week.
15%. Let's put real human numbers on that because percentages can be so abstract when we are talking about lives.
In the atenolol group, the people who got the drug, there were 313 deaths. In the control group, there were 365 deaths.
That is 52 fewer funerals.
Exactly. 52 lives saved out of the roughly 16,000 enrolled.
And statistically, the paper says they reached a 2p value of less than 0.04. I want to pause here for a second. For the listener who hasn't taken a statistics class since college, or maybe ever, let's unpack that. What is 2p less than 0.04 actually telling us in plain English?
It is essentially a probability score. It is asking the fundamental scientific question. Could this result have happened completely by accident? Could it be that the drug did absolutely nothing and we just got lucky that fewer people randomly died in the atenolol group?
Right, like flipping a coin and getting heads 5 times in a row. It doesn't mean the coin is rigged. It just means you had a weird streak.
Exactly. The p-value calculates the exact mathematical odds of that weird streak happening. A value of 0.04 means there's less than a 4% chance that this 52-person difference happened just by random luck. In science, anything less than 5% or 0.05 is usually considered the strict threshold for being statistically significant. So we are confident the drug did something real. We are at least 96% sure this wasn't a fluke.
But the source also specifically mentions wide confidence limits.
Right. And this is where scientists have to be humble. We know there is a real benefit. But because 15% is a moderate difference, the math tells us the true benefit isn't exactly pinned down to that one number. It could actually be a tiny 1% improvement, or it could be a massive 25% improvement. We pinned the most likely number at 15% based on this specific data set, but the absolute truth of the drug is somewhere in that wide range.
So we know the arrow hit the target board, but the exact ring it hit is a bit fuzzy.
That is a perfect way to put it. The target is fuzzy, but we know for a fact we hit the positive side of the board.
Still, 52 lives saved is 52 lives saved, no matter how fuzzy the exact percentage is. But here's where the data gets really interesting to me, the timing of those deaths.
Yes, this is what we call the magic window. When the researchers broke down the mortality data day by day, they saw something completely startling. Almost all of that survival benefit, those 52 lives, happened in day 0 and 1.
The very first 24 to 48 hours after walking into the hospital?
Precisely. There were 121 deaths in the atenolol group versus 171 in the control group just in that first tiny window of time.
Yeah.
That is a huge, undeniable gap.
And after that, what happened on days 2 through 7?
Very little difference at all. The survival curves run almost perfectly parallel. If you survived the first 2 days, your odds of dying on day 5 were about exactly the same whether you were taking the beta blocker pills or not.
That completely changes the narrative of the drug, doesn't it? It is not about taking beta blockers for a heart attack. It is about taking beta blockers right now, the second you feel the chest pain.
It implies heavily that the mechanism of benefit is tied specifically to that immediate intravenous injection. It is not just about taking an oral pill for a week. It is about chemically stopping the stress on the heart immediately after the attack begins. If you miss that window, if the doctor waits 48 hours to start the oral pills, you might miss the biggest chunk of the benefit entirely.
Speed kills, or rather in this case, a lack of speed kills.
Exactly. The intervention has to be acute.
Now, whenever we talk about powerful cardiovascular drugs, we have to talk about side effects. Did the atenolol actually hurt anyone? Because you are taking a heart that is already struggling, it's starved of oxygen, and you are chemically forcing it to slow down. That sounds incredibly risky to a layperson.
It is risky, and the data absolutely shows that. The treated group needed significantly more inotropic agents.
Inotropic agents, let's define that for the audience.
An inotrope is a drug like adrenaline or dopamine that you administer to mechanically force the heart muscle to pump harder. You use it in emergency situations when the heart is failing, when the blood pressure is completely crashing and the patient is going into shock.
So let me get this sequence straight. You gave them atenolol to slow the heart down. It slowed down too much. And then the doctors had to panic and give them adrenaline to speed it right back up.
In some cases, yes. That is exactly what happened. The treated group needed more of that drastic rescue support, mostly on day 0 right after the IV injection.
That sounds like a failure of the drug. That sounds like you actively made the patient worse.
It sounds like a severe complication, certainly. Ideally, you always want to avoid crashing a patient's blood pressure. But here's the key takeaway, and this is the fundamental paradox of emergency medicine. Even though more people in the treated group needed that extra chemical support, fewer of them died.
That is a crucial distinction. You caused a problem, dangerously low blood pressure, but it was a solvable problem.
Right. The side effects were intense, but they were reversible. The doctors in the ICU could manage a slow heart rate, they could monitor the monitors, see the dip, and give the inotrope to fix it, but they could not fix death. So the net clinical benefit was still heavily in favor of giving the drug. You take a calculated small risk of a manageable problem to avoid the ultimate unmanageable problem.
I really like that framing. You are trading a solvable crisis for a fatal one.
Exactly. It is a tactical trade-off.
So we know it works. We know it works fast. But why? Let's move into segment 3, the mechanism. What is this drug actually doing inside the chest cavity during an infarction?
It really all comes down to basic supply and demand. During a heart attack, you have a blocked coronary artery. That means a specific part of the heart muscle isn't getting fresh blood, which means it isn't getting oxygen. It is actively starving. That is your supply problem.
Okay, the pipe is clogged.
But the rest of the heart, the healthy tissue, doesn't know that. The brain senses a massive crisis, it registers pain, and it dumps adrenaline into the nervous system. The heart reacts to that adrenaline by beating faster, pumping harder, trying to compensate for the failing section, but doing that requires more oxygen.
Which is exactly what you do not have to give when you have a supply blockage.
Right. It is a fatal, vicious cycle. You are revving a car engine into the red zone, but there is no oil in the pan. The engine is going to destroy itself. The beta blockade steps in and chemically says, everybody calm down. It literally blocks those adrenaline receptors on the heart cells. It forces the heart rate lower. It forces the blood pressure lower. It dramatically reduces the physical work the heart has to do.
So you are basically putting the engine in neutral while you try to fix the oil leak.
Perfect analogy. By reducing the workload, you're reducing the oxygen demand of that starving tissue. Ideally, this protects the heart muscle from tearing itself apart or suffering further permanent damage. You are buying the tissue precious time to survive until the clot clears or surgery can happen.
The study actually tried to measure this physical damage, didn't it? I read that they looked at cardiac enzymes.
They did. When heart muscle cells die, they physically burst open and leak specific enzymes into the bloodstream. So logically, if the drug is working and protecting the heart, you should see lower enzyme levels in the blood of the treated group. Less dead muscle equals fewer leaked enzymes.
And what did the blood tests show?
The results were, unfortunately, inconclusive. They didn't see a massive, undeniable difference between the two groups.
That is disappointing. Does that mean the whole supply and demand theory is wrong?
Not necessarily. The source text points out that the measurement method they used in 1986 was pretty crude. They basically just asked the labs, did the enzyme levels go above double the normal upper limit? It was a simple yes or no bucket. It wasn't a precise, continuous measurement of exactly how much enzyme was floating around, so they probably just missed the nuance because their scientific ruler wasn't precise enough to measure the millimeters of difference.
But they did meticulously track other clinical events, like cardiac arrest.
Yes, they saw fewer cardiac arrests in the atenolol group, 189 versus 198.
Okay, 9 fewer arrests. That doesn't seem like a huge, statistically bulletproof gap out of 16,000 people.
On its own, it is not statistically significant. It could just be luck. And this brings us to one of the most powerful statistical tools that researchers use to prove their case, the combined endpoint.
What exactly is a combined endpoint?
Instead of looking at just death in a vacuum, or just cardiac arrest on its own, or just reinfarction, which is having a second heart attack while still in the hospital, they added them all together. They said, let's look at negative cardiovascular events as a whole package.
And when you stack all those negative events up,
The evidence becomes highly significant. The p-value drops through the floor to 2p less than 0.00002.
wow. Okay, so that is extremely strong evidence. That is basically 0% chance of being a fluke.
Extremely strong.
Yeah.
It mathematically suggests that if you treat 200 patients with this protocol, you avoid 1 death, 1 cardiac arrest, and 1 reinfarction.
That rule of 200 is a really great takeaway. It makes the abstract percentages very concrete for a practicing doctor. If I treat everyone coming through my ER doors this month, I will save 3 distinct people from a terrible outcome.
And that concrete reality is enough to change global medical practice. It decisively moves the needle.
But the skeptic in me, or maybe a skeptical listener, might ask, okay, you saved them on day 1 with the IV, but did they just die on day 8? Did you just chemical push the inevitable back by a week? Let's look at segment 4, the long game.
This is the vital question of persistence of benefit. Did the drug actually change the long-term trajectory of their life? The study didn't just stop at discharge. They actively followed these people for a full year.
And what happened?
The benefit lasted. At 1 year out, the total mortality rate was 10.7% for the atenolol group versus 12.0% for the control group.
So the gap actually remained. The survival curves didn't regress and come back together.
They didn't. The lives that were saved in that first frantic 24 hours stayed saved a year later.
There was a bit of a statistical catch-22 in the long-term data, though, wasn't there? Something about the control group getting the drug anyway.
Yes. This is known as the catch-up problem. Remember, this trial ran up until 1986. And by that time, regular doctors were starting to use beta blockers for long-term prevention anyway, just based on other evolving literature. So when the patients were discharged from the hospital, about 25% of the control group, the people who explicitly did not get the drug during the acute phase, were put on beta blockers by their own family doctors.
Ah, so the control group started getting the treatment eventually anyway.
Exactly. And meanwhile, the atenolol group was more likely to stay on them. About 35% of them did. So the clean comparison between groups gets incredibly messy after day 7 because both groups are intermingling and taking the drugs to some varying extent.
But despite that blurring of the scientific lines, despite the control group catching up, the original atenolol group still had lower death rates at 1 year.
Correct. And that implies something profound. It implies that the early advantage gained in days 0 and 1 was never lost. There was no rebound death spike when the acute treatment ended. It proves that the immediate day 0 intervention is totally distinct and uniquely valuable. You cannot make up for missing day 01 by taking pills on day 30.
I really want to pivot to something that I think is important for our listeners who love data analysis. Segment 5, the subgroup trap. The study authors actually spend a lot of ink warning us about this.
This is a masterclass in statistical philosophy. When you have a massive data set of 16,000 people, it is incredibly tempting to slice and dice it. You desperately want to ask, did it work better for diabetics? Did it work better for young people? Did it work better for people with high blood pressure?
Naturally, you want to target the treatment. Why give it to everyone and risk the side effects if it only actually works for men over 50?
But the authors specifically warn that doing this is statistically dangerous. If you slice random data into enough small buckets, you will inevitably find patterns that happen purely by chance. You generate false positives.
The source gives a very specific historical example of this, right?
Yes, regarding patient age. In a previous older study using a completely different beta blocker called alprazolam, the data suggested that the drug worked much better for people under 65 years old.
Okay, so younger patients.
But in this ISIS-1 trial, with a much larger group, the data looked like it worked significantly better for people over 65.
So they completely contradict each other.
Exactly. If you took either of those specific subgroup findings as gospel truth, you would be wrong. The expert speaker in me loves this point from the authors. Trust the overall main result. The main, massive result says the drug works for the general population. Do not get distracted by the noise in the tiny subgroups unless the outside evidence is overwhelming.
It is exactly like the coin flip again. If I flip a coin 10,000 times, it will be roughly 50-50. But if I just look at flips number 500 through 510, I might see 10 heads in a row and logically think, aha, the coin is broken.
That is the absolute perfect analogy. ISIS-1 warns us not to hyperfixate on the 10 heads in a row and completely ignore the other 15,990 flips that tell the real story.
They also make a very sharp distinction between retrospective and prospective hypotheses. That sounds super technical, but it is actually really important for understanding how we define scientific truth.
Yes. A prospective hypothesis is one you have before you even start the experiment. I think this drug will save lives overall. You run the test, and the math holds up. That is incredibly strong, robust science.
And a retrospective hypothesis.
That is looking at the data after the fact and spotting a shiny pattern. Oh, look, the benefit was almost entirely in day 0 and day 1.
But wait, wasn't the day 0 and 1 finding the absolute biggest takeaway from the entire paper?
It was. But the authors are intellectually honest enough to explicitly say, we did not predict this specific timing before we started. We found it in the data after we unblinded it. Therefore, as rigorous scientists, we should be slightly more cautious about treating it as absolute fact. It makes perfect biological sense, but strictly speaking, it is a data-derived hypothesis.
I have to say, I deeply appreciate that honesty. It actually makes me trust the study a lot more. They aren't trying to oversell their own genius.
It is the ultimate mark of high-quality science. They are showing their work, the brilliant parts and the messy warts, all of it.
Let's move to segment 6, the economic argument. Because we do not operate in a vacuum. Medicine costs money.
And in 1986, just exactly like today, healthcare resources were finite. The discussion section of the source brings up a really fascinating point about cost-effectiveness.
What is the actual price tag on saving a human life with atenolol?
They estimate it at just a few £100s.
A few £100 to save a human life.
It is almost unbelievably cheap. You have to remember, the drug itself was either off-patent or rapidly becoming generic, and the protocol was incredibly short. It is just one IV injection and 1 week of pills. You are not committing the healthcare system to a lifetime of extensive daily therapy.
How does that actually compare to other standard treatments of the time?
They explicitly compare it to treating mild hypertension, so high blood pressure. Now, treating high blood pressure is unequivocally good. It prevents strokes and heart failure over decades. But you have to treat thousands of people every single day for years and years to prevent one single death.
Which obviously costs an astronomical amount of money in cumulative drug costs.
Right. It costs tens of thousands of pounds per life saved.
So treating the acute heart attack immediately with beta blockers is a bargain.
It is one of the most efficient uses of healthcare dollars imaginable. You intervene right at the crisis point, you use a dirt-cheap drug, and you get a permanent, long-lasting survival benefit.
It is a massive high-yield investment for a hospital.
Exactly. The economics are as sound as the biology.
All right, we have thoroughly dissected the heart attack study. But as we promised at the top of the show, we have a double feature today. Let's shift gears completely to segment 7, the renal transplant study.
From the heart to the kidney.
The source material included the second distinct study, also published in The Lancet in 1986, HLA matching and pre-transplant blood transfusions?
We are essentially leaving the world of brute force numbers, the 16,000 patients, and entering the world of technological disruption.
This study is much smaller, only 613 patients located in Scandinavia. But it tells a really profound story about how new technology completely disrupts established medical rules.
Set the context for us. Before this specific study, what was a standard operating procedure for a kidney transplant?
So in the old days, meaning the 1970s and early 80s, it was widely believed that two things were absolutely vital for a transplant to work. First, HLA matching. You had to match the tissue type of the donor and the recipient as perfectly as humanly possible.
Right. It is like matching blood types, but vastly more complex. You were looking at specific genetic markers on the surface of the cells. You wanted the donor and the recipient to be practically genetic twins to avoid rejection.
And the second thing, which is incredibly surprising, was pre-transplant blood transfusions.
This is definitely the weird one historically.
Yeah, explain this to us. There was actual evidence that giving a patient multiple blood transfusions from random donors before they got a kidney actually helped their body accept the new organ later.
It sounds completely counterintuitive. You would logically think that pumping someone full of foreign blood would sensitize their immune system and make it angry and ready to attack. But in the 70s, observational data found it did the exact opposite. It induced a kind of weird tolerance. It primed the immune system to say, okay, foreign tissue in the body isn't an immediate threat.
So that was the absolute dogma. Match them perfectly and give them foreign blood.
Right. But then came cyclosporin.
The absolute wonder drug of the 80s.
Cyclosporin was a totally revolutionary immunosuppressant. It was a fungus-derived compound that was so much better at stopping organ rejection than anything that had ever come before it. So this Scandinavian study essentially asked, now that we have cyclosporin doing the heavy lifting, do we actually still need to do all that other archaic stuff?
And the answer they found?
The answer was, surprisingly, mostly no.
Really? It just wiped out the old rules.
Well, it is nuanced. They found that HLA matching did still reduce rejection episodes. The body fought the kidney somewhat less if the genetics were matched.
Okay, that is good. Fewer immune fights is obviously good.
But, and this is the huge but, neither the genetic matching nor the blood transfusions actually improved the ultimate patient survival or graft survival rates.
Wait, so you might have more rejection episodes, you might have the body fight the kidney, but you didn't actually die, and the kidney didn't ultimately fail.
Exactly. Cyclosporin was so incredibly powerful that it could rescue the kidney from those intense rejection episodes. It completely masked the baseline benefit of the genetic matching. The safety net of the new drug was so unbelievably strong that the high-wire act of perfect matching wasn't a life-or-death requirement anymore.
That is fascinating. It is like saying, imagine driving a car on a really dangerous, winding mountain road. In the 1970s, you needed to be a professional Formula One driver, meaning perfect genetic matching, just to survive the trip. But in 1986, cyclosporin is like inventing a massive steel guardrail. Now, even a relatively bad driver, a mismatched kidney, survives the trip because the guardrail catches them.
That is an absolutely brilliant analogy. The new technology, the cyclosporin, raised the floor so high that the old painstaking optimizations like matching and transfusions became far less critical for the ultimate goal, which is simply keeping the patient alive with a working kidney.
So the changing picture part of the title literally refers to this obsolescence of old protocols.
Precisely. It shows that medical truths are not permanent. They are highly dependent on the tools we have at our disposal. A protocol that is absolute life or death vital in 1980 might be completely redundant in 1986 simply because a new chemical compound arrived on the scene.
And what about the blood transfusions?
Completely useless in this new era. The study found literally zero benefit. The incredibly powerful drug completely washed out the subtle, weird immunologic effect of the transfusion.
So hospitals can just stop doing them entirely.
We can stop doing them. And that is a huge leap forward because transfusions carry massive inherent risks: disease transmission, allergic reactions, sensitization. If you absolutely do not need them to save the kidney, you should never do them.
Let's bring this all together in segment 8, final synthesis. We have two incredible studies here. One is about the sheer brute force of numbers in the heart, and one is about a massive technological shift in the kidney. How do they fundamentally connect?
They are both foundational pillars of evidence-based medicine. They represent the exact era when medicine stopped guessing based on theory and started proving based on outcomes.
ISIS-1 shows us the brute force of numbers. It teaches us about navigating the fog of war in medicine.
Right. It teaches us profound humility. We cannot trust our individual anecdotes. Saying, I gave this to my patient Bob and he lived, means absolutely nothing scientifically. You need 16,000 Bobs to see the 15% signal. You need to acknowledge that small but crucial benefits are totally invisible to the naked human eye.
And the renal study.
That teaches us adaptability. It shows that best practices always have an expiration date. When a revolutionary tool like cyclosporin appears, you have to be willing to rigorously retest all your old assumptions. You cannot just keep giving risky blood transfusions simply because that is how we have always done it.
There is also a very human element to the ISIS-1 story that really sticks with me, the intentional informality of the trial design.
I absolutely love that part.
They realized that if they wanted to save lives on a massive global scale, they had to make it remarkably easy for the actual doctors on the ground.
Simplicity in science can be an incredible virtue. If they had demanded a 20-page form and a triple confirmed diagnosis for every patient, they never would have recruited 16,000 people. The trial would have collapsed. And we might never have definitively known that 5-atenolol works in those crucial first hours.
They designed the scientific study for the chaotic real world, not the pristine ivory tower.
And precisely because of that pragmatic design, they got a real-world answer that has held up for decades.
So to wrap this up, the key takeaway from 1986 is clear. In a heart attack, speed is everything. That 5e beta blocker in the very first 24 hours is the ultimate game changer.
And statistically, we learned that to find small but incredibly vital life-saving benefits, we need massive collaboration. We need to think exponentially bigger.
It really makes you wonder, and this is something I want to leave you, the listener, with today. How many medical questions today are we actively failing to answer simply because we are thinking too small?
That is the ultimate provocative thought. We have so many experimental treatments today that might work just a little bit. Maybe they improve survival by 10%. But we run trials with 500 people. We see no statistically significant difference, and we just throw the drug away.
Are we throwing away the next atenolol?
We very well might be. If we are not willing to fund and coordinate the 20,000-person mega trials anymore, we are almost certainly missing out on moderate breakthroughs. We are constantly swinging for home runs, but we are completely ignoring the singles and doubles that actually win the game over a lifetime.
That is a sobering thought to end on. Truly changing science requires massive scale.
It absolutely does.
Thank you for watching The Funnel Effect.